Welcome to Introduction to Genetics and our first set of lectures. Our first week we're going to be going through chapters 1 and 2. This is a little bit unusual, but both of these chapters have a lot of review information that I think you probably had in Introduction to Biology, semester 1 here at SWIC. And chapter 1 itself is really sort of a big introduction. So I'm going to use it as just that, an introduction, and an example of why we're worried about genetics and why our book puts a big focus on evolution. So you'll notice the title of our book, Genetics, Genes, Genomes, and Evolution. We've got evolution in the title, and that's a theme that we're going to see throughout the book. So chapter 1 is really an example of how genetics and evolution is related. And then in chapter 2, we get into the foundation of genetics, which is the molecule of DNA. So for most chapters, you're going to be expected to know basically the entire chapter, or not the entire chapter, but whatever is encompassed in our study guide. And sometimes I'll go into a little bit more detail in the lecture. Sometimes you might have to go get some of that detail from the book. In general, I use my lectures to write my tests. So if we focus on it in the lecture, you can feel confident that the depth that we go into lecture is probably the depth that we're going to go into the test. Now, that does not mean that you personally might not have to go back to the book and read some of that depth to get a better understanding. But there's only so much time in lectures, even online lectures, because I am still committed to a specific amount of time. I don't get unlimited time even in online lectures. So along those lines, I try to keep these lectures to between 15 and 30 minutes, depending on what the actual topics are and how they break down. The nice thing is that if you get tired, you just pause it and you walk away, get a snack, take a bathroom break, whatever you need to do, come back to it at 2 in the morning or whatever you personally need to do. As far as the class structure, I am sort of in my mind, as far as preparation is concerned, I'm going to assume that you are watching the lectures at or around Wednesday. Now, our labs are set up for Mondays. If we were in class, we would have lab on Monday, lecture on Wednesday, and so that's the pattern I'm following. You, of course, are free to watch your lectures whenever you see fit, but as far as planning purposes and schedules and when homework and quizzes are due, I'm going to be assuming that by Wednesday or Wednesday-ish, you have some knowledge of the chapter. And therefore, by Friday, the end of the week, you should have your quiz done, your homework done. And the way that I've set up the labs is, for the most part, the following week after the lecture, we will have the corresponding lab. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's how I've tried to plan it, so that you don't necessarily have to watch the lecture before the lab. The other important thing about this online lecture format is that you have to be a self-starter. You have to sit down and do your stuff on time. No one is going to force you into working on it on Wednesday. So you have to watch the lectures with enough time to ask for help, to be able to study for quizzes, to be able to apply the homework. So that being said, you have to reach out if you need help. I can't look at you and see that you are not understanding it in the middle of a video lecture when you're watching it asynchronously from me teaching it. I'm not going to require you to watch it as I do it. There's just too many factors, too many schedules to deal with. So that means that you have to take the initiative to set up your schedule so that you get your things done and get all of your classes done as the schedule works for you. So let's dive into chapter 1. The first section of chapter 1 is actually a little bit of an overview. It's not specifically in our textbook, but just sort of set the stage for what genetics is, where we are in sort of the timeline of the history of biology, and how genetics and evolution fit together. So what is genetics? We always start off our science classes with defining what we're actually doing. Genetics is a field of biology that focuses on the study of inherited genetic material. It focuses on where that genetic information is stored, how it's passed on to the next generation, and how it's expressed or actually used in individual organisms. So genetic information is basically the code for making things work. That code is found in our DNA, and so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what DNA is, how it works, how it stores information, how it's passed on, and how it's used to actually affect the structure and function of living organisms. So genetics is basically the study of heredity. Heredity is the passing or the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. So you're most familiar with this when you say something like, oh, my brother has a big nose just like my grandfather, or I have my mom's thick curly hair, or everyone in my family has hazel eyes, or whatever it may be. You guys have all said these things. You've heard your families talk about things. You recognize this when you see people in the same family together. They share these sort of traits. So the genetics is the study of how organisms pass on that information and how that information creates this relatedness between them. All organisms pass on their genetic information. So we're going to talk about how cells divide, how cells actually pass on information. And when we do this, we're going to start to see why individuals in families start to look like each other. As a quick review, I want to touch on a couple of important vocabulary words just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. We will come back to all of these and define them a little more specifically as we go on in the semester. But since I'm going to start right off the bat talking about these things and using some of these terms, I want to make sure that we're all starting off with a same real general definition. So the genetic information in a cell provides a plan or a framework, basically an instruction manual for how an organism is going to be built and function. And that plan is governed by some key features of how all of this genetic information works. So one of the important things that we're going to talk about is the genotype of an individual. The genotype is the genetic information or the genetic code, the DNA code within a cell. So each individual has a very specific set of information. Now, genotype refers to something very specific. It is going to be related to a gene, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But a genotype is the specific set, the specific code for a particular trait. Phenotype is the physical appearance or the outward expression of that genotype. So this is going to be something like blue eyes, dark skin, freckles, things like that. Phenotype is not necessarily a physical characteristic that you can actually see. Sometimes it is a metabolic pathway, sometimes it's a biochemical process, sometimes it's a protein within a cell that you never even know that's functioning. So there's a lot of different things that fall under phenotype, but the general idea is that it's the outward expression of that genetic information. DNA is our coding molecule. So this is the actual piece of the puzzle that maintains all of this information. So I like to think of it as an instruction manual full of little chapters that control different parts of the body, different functions within an organism. I often say body referring to humans, but just keep in mind that all of these things are applicable to animals, plants, bacteria, yeast, whatever organism you're studying. They all have genotypes, phenotypes, DNA, genomes, all of that. A genome is all of the genetic information within within an organism. So all of the genetic information in a particular organism. Now, this might mean my genome, so all of the specific information for me. It might mean the human genome. Now, my genome and your genome are essentially the same. We all have the same genes. I'll get to those in a minute. We all have the same genes in the same places, doing the same types of things. That doesn't mean that every version of the gene is the same between you and me, but it does mean we all have the same genes working within our body. The genome of a chimpanzee is going to be different than the human genome. A genome of the fruit fly or of the mouse or of the dog or a house cat, whatever organism, they are each going to have their own specific genomes. And that genome is the set of all of the information within that organism. Now, the genome is contained within cells. So each cell contains an entire copy of the genome within a multicellular organism. Now, a gene, which probably should have been at the top actually, is a specific set of instructions. So these are going to code for a particular genotype, a particular phenotype in an organism. So this might be something like lactose intolerance. So we have a gene called the lactase gene, and the lactase gene is going to produce a protein, which is going to be our phenotype, that either does or does not break down milk. So a gene is a specific set of instructions, often that codes for a protein that is going to give a particular phenotype, contain particular instructions for a particular function or a particular characteristic within an organism. Now, we are going to come back to genes several times throughout the semester. We're going to be updating and changing the definition. We're even going to sort of update it immediately in this lecture because depending on what level you're looking at, genes can change a little bit. And so a lot of these definitions we're going to define more specifically a little bit later, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. So let's look at a little bit of history to sort of set the stage for where we are and why we're studying the topic of genetics. So genetics as its own defined field is a relatively new field. The field of genetics really didn't start until the 1950s, but it has its origins a lot farther back. Now, the reason it didn't really start as sort of a classified field until the 1950s is there was not the technology available to see all of these processes. And we really couldn't even begin to think about genetics until we discovered the idea of a cell. So in the 1930s, we have two scientists, Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann. They put together something called the cell theory. Now, the cell theory is really important because the cell theory tells us that cells are the smallest living unit. Okay, so the cell is the smallest part of an organism that is considered alive. Now, cells can be living on their own. So some organisms are prokaryotic, meaning they're only one cell comprising the entire organism, or they can be eukaryotic, which is a group of cells that work together to form an organism. So Schleiden and Schwann came up with this cell theory that says all organisms are composed of basic units called cells, and those cells are derived from pre-existing cells. Now, keep in mind that this comes from the idea that cells are the smallest living unit. So cells are the smallest living structure, and they don't spring out of nowhere. They come from pre-existing cells. So when they come from pre-existing cells, that's where we get the field of genetics. And so we're going to talk about how that genetic information is passed on. There's a strong link between genetics and evolution, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in this lecture and later in the semester, because evolution is a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. And we get this first sort of classification of the idea of evolution from Charles Darwin in the late 1850s. So Charles Darwin wrote this really famous book called On the Origin of Species. And in this, he outlined the idea of evolution and natural selection. So the idea of natural selection is that individuals who have inherited advantageous traits pass them on to the offspring. And as the offspring in the population accumulate those advantageous traits and lose the disadvantageous ones, the population begins to change. Now, the important thing is that it's inheritable. It is heritable information, and there we have genetics again. So we've got the cell theory, we've got the idea that cells come from other cells, and now we have the idea that information from one generation can be passed on to the next. Then we get to Gregor Mendel. So in the 1860s, Gregor Mendel was working with pea plants, and he established a pattern of inheritance within those pea plants. So he was able to show that particular traits were passed from parent to the next generation of peas in a very predictable manner. So now we have some bit more concrete physical evidence that information, specific information, is passed from one generation to the next. And so we start to see between Charles Darwin talking about how populations change and Mendel with actual physical traits being passed on, we are starting to see the beginnings of this idea of genetics. As we continue on a little bit later, the late 1800s, we start to see improvements in microscopy. We see evidence of cell division. We start to see the processes in a microscope of mitosis and meiosis. And then we start to see chromosomes. So chromosomes are the large structures that are made of DNA. So now we have some microscopic evidence of something physical that can be passed on to the next generation. So the chromosomal theory of inheritance, produced in the early 20th century by two scientists named Sutton and Boveri, said that the genetic information that is passed on resides on those chromosomes, and it is actually those chromosomes or physical pieces of DNA that pass on that genetic information. So now we're going to skip ahead just a little bit. Remember, I said we're skipping a lot of information here, but we're just sort of setting the framework. We're going to skip ahead to the mid-1950s. So this is starting to get into maybe even probably your grandparents, not even quite my parents yet. My dad was born in 1956, so really my grandparents' generation, maybe even your great-grandparents, depending on how young you are. So this is where genetics as a field actually sort of takes off. So in 1953, two very famous scientists, they weren't famous at the time, they're famous now, James Watson and Francis Crick, actually described the molecular structure of DNA. So they looked at those chromosomes and figured out what they were built of and how they were put together. And we're going to come back to this a little bit more in chapter 2. But this was really important because it gave us a structure and a mechanism for replication. So how we can copy that DNA, or they proposed a way to copy that DNA. And then shortly after that, how it can be used to make proteins. So as early as the late 1950s, we're starting to see theories on how this genetic information can be used and how it can be working as a coding molecule. And that's really important because it is being able to contain that code and then also pass it on or replicate it for the next generation. Those are two really important things for the study of genetics.